Yakuza Like a Dragon was a game made by 3 men in a shed. Or at least, you would assume it was, because despite how much fun it was, there were a lot of things that didn't really have all too much thought put into them. Unlike the products of Accuracy International, which that's what the 3 men in a shed joke was referencing, Like a Dragon was far from precise when it came to the balancing of skills. Fair, given how this was the development team's first ever proper RPG, but it was kinda their own fault for having like 700 skills, 600 of which do the exact same goddamn thing. The best example of this, which I am now going to bring up for the 700th time, is Dropkick and Ruffian's Kick, 2 skills available to the protagonist's starting job or class of Freelancer. They were both a single kick that would send the enemy flying, they both dealt medium damage, and the only difference stated was that one consumed less MP, but allegedly had a higher chance of landing a critical hit, whereas the other consumes more MP and doesn't have a higher crit chance. If you expected the one that costs more MP to deal more damage, you'd be right. However, for an additional 33% MP cost, the attack only dealt an average of 2.3% more damage when I did some tests back in late 2022. What's worse is that the more expensive skill of Ruffian's Kick was unlocked 4 levels after Dropkick, which you would probably assume would mean it would be better, but if you assumed that, the developers would simply say haha lol. So long story short, Ruffian's Kick was a blatantly worthless skill in the last game. However, Ichiban still has Freelancer in the sequel of Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth, and much to my surprise it is a significantly better job. With this job, Ichiban still can't equip any weapons, meaning he won't get any attack boosts from them, but thankfully they actually stopped and thought about it for more than 2 seconds, and Ichiban's raw attack stack gets a much larger boost for every job level up when compared to other jobs. It still isn't as good as most other jobs, especially not Hero or the Dragon of Dojima, but it is at least significantly more usable than the last game. Although, one interesting thing is that despite all of the skills being the exact same with none removed and no new ones added, they all are touched up in one way or another. For example, Headbutt Barrage doesn't have a 48-minute animation, and Hyper Swagger, thanks to buffs and debuffs being reworked, can now be stacked, and it also doesn't last 1 turn, even though it says it lasts for 2. But anyway, Dropkick and Ruffian's Kick, when reading their descriptions, are the exact same. They both deal knockback with low accuracy but a guaranteed critical hit. However, Ruffian's Kick costs 10 MP more and deals medium damage instead of light. So you know what that means. It's time to finally put my economics degree to good use and do some maths. So I went ahead and did the same test that I did over a year ago with Like a Dragon, and went and used both kicks on the same enemy, although this time I've done it 10 times for better results because it's less of a pain in the ass in this game, being sure to use all the same parameters each time. Fortunately, having them always crit means I don't have to worry about them landing crits, but anyway, Dropkick dealt a total of 7,668 damage, averaging at 766.8 damage per attack. But then Ruffian's Kick, which last time only dealt about 2% more damage, has now dealt a total of 9,140, averaging at 914 per attack. So then, with a difference in average damage of 147, being about 19.2% of 766.8, this means that you can basically deal 20% more damage with Ruffian's Kick at a cost of 10 more MP, which would be 50% more MP cost, but considering how 10 MP is actually very little when you get past like the halfway point of the game, that's a pretty freaking good trade-off. So if you want to do as much damage as possible between the 2 moves, you go Ruffian's Kick, but then if the enemy is low on health or you want to try and conserve more MP, Dropkick is still there as an option. But from this information, we can determine one pretty solid thing and one kinda guess. The kinda guess is that the biggest gap between an attack and the average was one of the Dropkicks dealing 730 damage, which was about 4.92% lower than the average. We'll get to it later, but I made sure to check the damage range for each test I did for this video, and from this data, it seems pretty reasonable that maybe the attack range for everything in this game is plus or minus 5%, and with this example that's fair because rolling that additional 0.8% would be super hard to do. There were a couple of outliers throughout my future tests, but those outliers were with stuff that dealt like additional damage, so it was harder to determine exactly. But 5% does sound reasonable, except these developers are not known for ever being reasonable. On the other hand, the fact that is much easier to guarantee is that the percentage increase from a light attack to a medium attack, given the plus or minus 5% thing, is probably around 20%, meaning that a medium skill is actually 1.2 times stronger than a light skill. This is all very important to point out because in Yakuza Like a Dragon, light, medium, heavy, or extreme damage skills were all a fucking lie. Furthermore, the MP cost of something also just felt completely random, especially given how in Infinite Wealth a lot more skills cost a number ending in 5 or 0, which I'm sure some people say is worse, but it's better than something costing 21 MP, or 6, like the skill Head Trauma, which once again would like to point out that the reason it's so dumb is because it is a light attack that costs 6 MP, being one of the cheapest skills in the game, and it does more damage than most attacks in the game. So no person whose brain came in an update, it is not one of the most mediocre skills ever. Let's now compare head trauma real quick to a bunch of other skills that Junki Han can use. So first of all, I used head trauma, a light damage skill that cost me 6 MP and dealt to this enemy 1,203 damage, and that was without doing the action prompt for extra damage. Then I used cheap shot, a medium attack that costs 22 more MP, and after hitting every action prompt, it dealt an additional 90 damage. Just 90. Then I did neck twister, a heavy attack that costs 29 more MP than head trauma, and although I didn't hit the action prompt with this one, because, man, those like single button prompts were shit in Like a Dragon, they were so inconsistent. Anyway, it did 791. Which is way less than head trauma. Then I did Banshee Bayonet, which is also a heavy skill that costs 35 MP, except it takes 2 turns to use, and I dealt 958 damage. Which, yes, the enemy guarded it, and it definitely would have done more otherwise, but there's no indication an enemy is guarding in Like a Dragon, but head trauma also just hits through guards. But then finally I paralyzed the enemy and used Essence of Assassin Dive, a Kiwami attack that costs 52 MP, so 46 more than head trauma, which also deals increased damage to paralyzed enemies, and would you believe it, it did bloody 1,231 damage, being 28 more than head trauma without an action prompt. Did literally no one on the team stop to think about how absurdly overpowered the move was? Like, it was so overpowered that the only way they could think to nerf it in Infinite Wealth was to just remove it entirely. But anyway, now that I've pretty clearly shown that Yakuza Like a Dragon's damage values were just a bunch of randomly picked numbers, it's time to try and do some more experiments to see more values for Infinite Wealth, because, you know, why the hell not? Firstly, to determine the rough damage increase from a critical hit, I'll use Tenacious Fist, which is a light skill, 10 times on the same enemy, and we'll go from there. My theory with damage values in this game is that so long as there aren't any other modifiers like stat changes or crits, all light skills deal roughly the same amount of damage as each other, regardless of the skill or job or whatever. So with Tenacious Fist doing the action prompt, I dealt an average damage of 490.7. This meant that there was a 56.2% damage increase between Tenacious Fist and Dropkick, which would mean that a critical hit theoretically would be a 1.56 times increase, which again, knowing RGG, could be the case, but it doesn't sound all too reasonable. You'd expect it to be 1.5 times like Pokemon, for example. It obviously isn't something like Fire Emblem, which is a 3 times increase for a crit. Even subtracting 5% doesn't give us that value. However, I did land a critical hit with Tenacious Fist, which dealt 738 damage. That was a roughly 50.4% increase, which despite it being a very low roll, is still actually in the previously determined damage range of Dropkick, and brings us to a much more reasonable 1.5 times increase from a crit. 1.5 times again sounds pretty reasonable, but I have no idea if they have any extra properties like being able to hit through stat changes or something like that. But you see, when I did Dropkick and Tenacious Fist, I hit the damage prompts every time. And after doing the same test with Tenacious Fist 10 times without hitting the prompt, the average damage was 421, which means that with the prompt, it was about 16.5% stronger than without it. But then on the other hand, I did a Dropkick without the prompt, and although I only did one, the average damage was about 10% stronger than the single hit. Now with action prompts, there's a lot of things that are potentially a consideration. Both attacks are a single hit, but one was a timed button press and the other was a button mash. Perhaps those have different modifiers. I also noticed from testing that multi-hit moves divvy up the damage between all of the hits. Some multi-hits will have multiple action prompts. So for example, if an attack does a total of 500 damage and has 3 hits, it might make the first 2 deal 25% and the final one deal 50%. So that way it's 125, 125, 250. But do the action prompts increase damage based on the predicted total or the individual hits? I really have no idea at all, and there's way too many variables for me to give a fuck about. So what I'm going to say is that maybe action prompts have like a 10 to 20% boost, or perhaps it's 10 to 15 and those percentage boosts stack on top of things like crits and whatnot, leading to a higher value than 15. So what I'm going to do with all further tests is not at all touch the action prompt and cut out any crits I get unless I say otherwise. The reason for this is because I am going to move over to a different enemy type with more health, so it's less annoying, and do a whole wide range of a bunch of different tests. These tests consisted of 375 recordings, so I'm glad it's over, because a lot of them were making me want to die. But anyway, I made sure to always load my save and keep Ichiban on the freelancer job without touching any gear or anything else for clear results. First up, I'm going to test out basic attack damage to determine a good baseline for damage. I'm going to go ahead and assume that your damage from your basic attacks are essentially a 1x damage modifier to whatever formula the game uses to determine damage, and not that it's actually like 0.7 times or something, and light skills are actually the baseline for damage, but whatever. After hitting the same guy 10 times, I got an average damage of 213.2, then after that, I did 10 proximity attacks and got an average damage of 254.7, which is specifically a 19.47% rounded up increase from a regular basic attack. This was something I roughly determined back in a video I did about the demo for this game, and it still reigns true that proximity bonuses are seemingly about 20% stronger, with the only exception being the dragon job, which has different attacks that feel way stronger than 20%. But then next was 10 back attacks that I did on the enemy, which gave me an average damage of 511.8. This was a 140% increase, or a 2.4 times increase, which no wonder they're bloody insane. Now at first I wondered if what it was doing was making it so that each hit in the basic attack becomes a critical hit no matter what, because if you think about it, 3 50% increases would add up to a 150% increase, but when doing that, the numbers aren't anywhere near as close. So it's pretty safe to assume that again, it just multiplies the anticipated total by 2.4 times and divvies up the damage amongst the 3 hits. Also, a 2.5 times increase for a back attack seems reasonable, but considering how on the dot this difference was to 140%, I think it might be safe to assume a back attack is actually a 2.4 times increase. Now it's honestly way too hard to test, I'm sorry, but it does seem like basic attacks, grounded attacks, combo attacks, follow-up attacks, and weapon attacks get a proximity bonus. Only regular and weapon attacks get back attack bonuses of those ones, I think, and it seems like with the combo attacks, only the initiator gets a damage boost from being in proximity, which I'll look at later, but there are no proximity bonuses for back attacks, considering you have to be in close proximity to do them. But speaking of grounded attacks, or attacking an enemy who has been knocked to the ground, I, despite my many hours of testing, could only ever get one recording, because every single freaking time some other party member had to be a dickhead and do a follow-up attack, which makes the enemy stand back up. But from the one test I did, I dealt 421 damage, which is 1 damage off getting Rey Narvaez Jr.'s attention, but is also a 97.46% increase from the average basic attack. Therefore, considering the 5% damage range on attacks, it's safe to assume that an attack on a downed enemy is a 2 times damage increase. Probably. Now with follow-ups, again they were a pain in my dick to do, so I only managed to get 5 of them, but the results are seemingly fairly simple. The average damage was 237, but there were 2 hits that were significantly weaker than the other 3, and definitely not in that 5% range. But the 3 stronger ones occurred when Ichiban was actually in close proximity to the enemy, so it seems like even when doing a follow-up attack, you can still get a proximity bonus, because the 3 stronger values fit into the proximity attack damage range determined earlier, as well as the 2 weaker ones fitting into the basic attack damage range. But now to test the damage of combo attacks, I'll do the same test with Junki Han this time, of attacking the same enemy 10 times with plain old regular attacks. Now I have no special gear on, and I didn't change it between recordings, so its attack was roughly the same as Ichiban's, and I was using the gauntlets you get given in the story for free, lol, they cost 140,000 anyway. From these attacks, I got an average damage of 224.6, but then with combo attacks, it is actually based off of the stats of both party members doing individual attacks, and I can prove this by showing you a follow-up attack with Namba, who I intentionally gave a shit weapon to, and he dealt significantly less damage than Junki Han and Ichiban, who I did 10 combo attacks with. Ichiban's average damage was 169.6, whereas Junki Han's was 178. Now, as I determined before, even in a follow-up attack, a non-player controlled party member can get a proximity bonus, and perhaps it does still work the same with combo attacks, although considering the second party member just teleports in, I don't think the game recognizes their own proximity, but you do get a proximity damage bonus with the initiator, as you can see from this clip, where Ichiban dealt considerably more damage. Regardless, from the tests, both party members dealt almost exactly 20% less damage than the average damage of their basic attacks. So I think it's pretty conclusive that combo attacks apply a 0.8 times damage modifier to both party members, which sounds bad, but being able to attack with potentially your 2 strongest party members to create a higher amount of damage than a regular attack, and recovering MP and hype gauges for both of them is the benefit of a combo attack. Then I wanted to try out weapon attacks, which I just went and hit the same enemy 10 times with a bench. Now, different weapon types, such as traffic cones, all those little bottles and balls and shit you chuck at people, probably do have different damage properties, but for now, all I could really do consistently were these benches. So, after doing 10, I got an average damage of 420.8, oh, there he was, 420.8 damage, which much like that downed attack, is very, very near a double damage increase from a basic attack. So again, pretty safe to assume a park bench is double damage. But now that all of that basic attack stuff is out of the way, it's time to check skills, which gets a lot trickier unfortunately, but I hope you stick with me. And real quick, considering we're talking about a bunch of percentages and stuff, 487% of you are unsubscribed, which is just a fucking ludicrous number. I didn't even realize I could get that high. Anyway, sort that out if you haven't already. We'll start with Tenacious Fist, a light skill, making sure that I never hit the action prompt in any of these recordings. After 10 hits, the average damage was 429, which means that it is roughly 101.2% stronger than a basic attack, or about 2 times stronger. Then I use Rapid Dance Kick, medium skill from the Action Star job, which had an average damage of 488.2, being 128.9% increase, so it's reasonable to assume it's a 2.3 times increase from a basic attack. Then Headbutt Barrage, which is a heavy skill, had an average damage of 583.4, which is then 173.6% stronger, so either a 2.7 or perhaps more likely a 2.75 times increase from a basic attack. Then I use the all reliable Release Gem and Suplex, which is an extreme skill, giving me an average damage of 704.6, being now a 230.4% increase, or likely a 3.3 times increase from a basic attack. Then finally, I wanted to see if a Kiwami attack, which also deals extreme damage, would be stronger or the same, considering you can't do action prompts with those. So I did Essence of Roadside Weapon, which is Ichiban's hit action attack, and got an average damage of 802.3, being about 100 damage stronger than the Suplex, which is 276.3% stronger than a basic attack, or a 3.7 times 6 increase. However, when adding the expected damage from an action prompt being basically 10 to 15% stronger, it seems as though Kiwami moves pretty much just automatically have the damage increase of an action prompt when compared to regular extreme damage skills. But now there's another damage modifier that I honestly never realized existed until I did testing for this. But if you break an enemy's guard with a guard break, so a grapple attack, you'll deal increased damage. Now the amount this increases it by is actually quite a lot, and after doing 10 guard breaks with the Suplex, rather than getting something closer to the Kiwami moves, I instead got an average damage of 927. This meant that it was 31.56% stronger, so somewhere in the range of a 1.3 to 1.35 times damage increase when breaking an enemy's guard. Now once again, this damage multiplier doesn't just do it on the attack that actually breaks their guards, because some grapples have multiple hits, but it just adds it to the total anticipated damage. Then the next thing I'm going to check is weaknesses, and this enemy I keep on fighting was weak to fire. So what I did was I made Junkihan a host, and considering that I don't know exactly how attacks that are like a gun attack that also does fire damage work, I'm just going to test it on raw magic skills that deal raw fire damage. And also, you may already know this, but magic attacks can't land critical hits, nor can they miss, besides when the game is dumb and misses because hitboxes don't match up, but they're programmed to not let enemies dodge the attacks, so that stuff makes damage consistency much easier. But magic attack is based off of your magic stat, which Junkihan's wasn't as high as his attack was as a hitman, and then damage is then based off of the enemy's willpower and stuff, so I just thought I would put that out there because it won't be the same as his stuff would be as a hitman. Anyway, I first did 10 attacks with Birthday Bonanza, which is a heavy skill, and I dealt an average damage of 415.6. Then I went and used Rose Stinger 10 times, which is a heavy fire attack and this enemy was weak to fire, and dealt an average damage of 683. This meant that I had a damage increase of about 64.34%, which if I had to guess what the reasonable damage increase would be, I'd guess a 1.65 times increase for hitting weaknesses. Now, I will get to it later, but this game doesn't have percentage attack type resistances like the last game, but something to consider is that every enemy's weakness may not actually be the same. But ignoring that for now, I then went back to Ichiban and raised his attack by 1, 2, and 3 stages and worked out the average damage of each. With a level 1 increase, I got an average damage of 277.7, being roughly a 23.23% increase from the 213.2 damage from a regular attack from earlier. Then with a level 2 buff, I got an average damage of 343.9, being roughly a 38% increase, and finally, with a level 3 buff, I got 409.1 average damage, being roughly a 47.89% increase. So considering the 5% damage range of attacks, it might be fair to assume a level 1 increase is 1.2 or 1.25 times, a level 2 increase is perhaps a 1.4 times increase, and then a level 3 increase is maybe a 1.5 times increase. But then when it comes to magic increases, I would assume it's the same, as well as the negative buffs are having inverse values, so a level 3 debuff might be a 0.5 times decrease. Defense and willpower buffs I would also assume probably are the same story, and also that all of these buffs would give the same value to the enemy. Stuff like ailment resistance, evasion, and crit chance buffs and debuffs are also chances, so screw testing those. The next thing I'm going to test is some gear related stuff. So the first thing is that at the workshop there's a bunch of enhancements you can do to your weapons in the form of the brands. Now there's a lot of success rate altering things, as well as stuff like allowing magic attacks to land critical hits, but what I'll look at are the ones that boost damage and greatly boost damage of certain attack types. However, I'm just going to do it with fire attacks, and I'm going to assume that the damage increase will be the same across all things. So for example, the greatly boost gun attacks will increase gun attacks the same amount that the greatly increase ice attacks will increase ice attacks. So first of all, I swapped to an enemy type on the other side of the bridge that wasn't weak to fire for better results, and I set a baseline by doing Rose Stinger again 10 times with no boosts at all. From this I got an average damage of 499.8. I then went and chucked on the small seal to get a minor boost to fire damage, and I equipped it on a weapon that had the exact same magic as the previous weapon I was just using, so that the stats wouldn't be altered at all. With the small boost, I got an average damage of 510.4, which is a whopping 2.1% damage increase. Well, it costs literally $5, so who cares? I next did the same thing as before, but now with the seal that greatly increased fire damage, which gave me an average damage of 533.9, which is a 6.8% increase. So not very great, is it? Again, I'm going to assume the rest of the seals are all a piss increase, which if you're watching this and have just realized how shit they are, you're probably better off with stuff like allowing magic attacks to crit, because then you'll get like a 50% increase and be way better off. But then something else I was curious about was another thing that claimed to greatly increase physical damage, being these knuckles for the hitman job. So I went to the same enemy because they don't resist fire and these do fire damage, and equipped the story knuckles I had on earlier and did a light attack 10 times, giving me an average damage of 516.7. Then I equipped these physical gauntlets, making sure that stats-wise they had the same attack as the other ones, and got an average damage of 648.2. This meant then that it was roughly a 25.45% increase, or pretty much a 1.25 times increase, which despite the fact that it also said it greatly increased damage, is certainly much higher than a 6.8% increase. So this made me wonder if all the seals at the workshop are different, but then I remembered the wording of greatly increase is probably just a bunch of random bullshit RGG Studio made up. Now then, some more specific things I wanted to look at were with the samurai job. With that job, there are the arrow skills that claim to deal even more damage when hitting the action prompt, and then there are also the skills that deal more damage to an enemy that's bleeding. So what I decided to do was go back to the same guy as before and use Dreaming Arrow 10 times without and 10 times with the action prompt. So first of all, without the action prompt I got an average damage of 500.9, but then hitting the action prompt should give us a theoretically higher increase than 10 to 15%, and so I got an average damage of 579.6, which is a 15.71% increase. So look, it does increase the damage even more than a regular action prompt, and who knows, maybe I got a bunch of low rolls, but once again RGG Studio making shit up because that's not much of a great increase. But anyway, I then wanted to test the samurai skills that deal increased damage to bleeding enemies. So for this I made all the boys a samurai and got Tomizawa, Nanba and Adachi without weapons to inflict bleed, then each bum would come in and do a light skill. But first I did Shadow Slash 10 times on a healthy enemy and dealt an average of 392.6 damage. Then I made them bleed and yada yada. I'll end it thus: Reflect Fire, Smirk, one-shot the whole party, talk to Karen, and I dealt an average damage of 554.8. Now this is where it's at, because that gave me an increase of 41.31%, or probably around a 1.4 times increase. That is how you do damage increases. I assume from that too that stuff like Junkihan's ultimate weapon that deals more damage to enemies that have status effects would probably be just as good, but that is just a pain in the ass to test, but it's probably good, I don't know. There's also other specific jobs I would have tested, like Kunoichi having attacks that deal more damage depending on your agility buff, but it seems like stuff like that just makes you do more attacks rather than technically technically more damage. So yeah, I'm sorry for not getting to those in this video. But speaking of status effects, what I will test is the damage increase you get when attacking an enemy that's asleep. So I put the same enemy to sleep with Jungi Han's sleep stuff and used Tenacious Fist 10 times. From this I got an average damage of 630.4, which when compared to the earlier test with Tenacious Fist that gave us an average of 429, it meant that there was roughly a 47% increase. So basically, hitting an enemy that's asleep just more or less gives you a critical hit. Then what I wanted to test was the damage of wall bounds, which is when an enemy gets hit with knockback into a wall and they bounce with this specific animation. So after smacking a guy into a wall 10 times, I got an average damage of 212.5. But now something I wanted to check was whether or not wall bound damage was calculated from your stats or from the strength of the attack used to knock them into the wall. So I went from a light attack to an extreme one and knocked the guy into the wall, which dealt 372 damage, which is obviously much higher than the 5% range of the previous average. So those attacks had an average damage of 428.2, which means that the average damage of the wall bounds is 48.7% of the damage of the attacks, meaning that it's fair to assume that hitting a wall bound will deal about half the damage of the attack used to knock an enemy into the wall. But you can also knock enemies into objects and stuff like explosive barrels. So I went and carefully moved these enemies into a perfect position to smack them into a barrel, and did 2 light attacks and 1 extreme attack, which caused the barrel to do a piddly 42, 43, and 44 damage. Meaning then that damage of that stuff is based on some completely different value and isn't determined by your stats or attack. What those values are, I don't know, unfortunately. Then the final test goes back to resistances. So this game just has an arrow up or down on enemies or party members to show that you resist an attack type or an enemy resists an attack type, but the game doesn't tell you what this seemingly fixed damage amount is, and even though it doesn't show you at all in terms of having like 2 arrows or something like that, there are charms you can get that allow you to greatly resist an element. So after trying for goddamn ages and getting really pissed off, I went and removed all of Ichiban's armor so we could get higher values, and got hit with the same ice move from this enemy type 10 times. This meant I took an average damage of 236.8. Then I did the same thing, but this time equipping the charm that makes me resist ice, meaning that I took an average damage of 203.5. So then this made me take roughly 14.1% less damage, and so again it could be reasonable that it's actually a 15% reduction when resisting something, but this was the enemy attacking me, so for now I won't make any assumptions. But then I equipped the charm that makes it so that you greatly resist ice, and I took an average hit of 179.2. This was then a 24.32% damage decrease, which is definitely more than 14%. So there now exists a problem of, do certain jobs that resist an element just resist or greatly resist? Is it the same story with enemies? Can you stack both ice resist charms and take even less damage? Well, actually I could test that last one, but I was just getting so freaking angry from this stupid idiot who just never did the attack I wanted, but anyway. It's a little more consistent than attack type resistances in the last game, but unfortunately this is an area where RGG's determination to troll players really shines. And now we come to a bunch of random observations I took note of while gathering data for this video. The first one is that with status ailments that inflict damage over time, the amount of damage taken per turn is seemingly either determined by the damage of the attack that caused the status effect, or it's based off of the stats of the person inflicting the status. This theory is a little too hard to test in all honesty, considering you can't see enemies' total health, but I at least know when testing the ice resistance stuff that regardless of the fact that everyone's health was different, everyone was taking 68 damage per turn when they got hit with a cold. I also still don't know whether bleed might deal more damage than cold because it can spread to other people, so that's how they make it better. And I also can't really tell the varying damage values of poison and burn. You can see this in the help menu, but poison deals a small amount of damage on the first turn, then more on the second, and then the most on the third. Then burn is the exact opposite, dealing the most amount of damage on the first turn, yada yada so on. That much is true, but again, how much the values vary is just too hard to tell. At the very least, Chitose got burnt while I was doing stuff, and she took 147 damage on the first turn, then about 40% less damage on the second turn, taking 88 damage, then about 67% less than that, making her take 29 damage. Then also something I figured out very quickly when I first started playing the game, but got a bit more definitive proof, is that when you knock one enemy into another, the amount of basically bowling pin damage, as I'll call it, that gets dealt to the other enemy or enemies is basically the same as using whatever attack you just used, but on the other enemy. So if you deal 500 damage to one enemy with a skill, but would have dealt say 600 to another one because they're much weaker, knocking the 500 damage enemy into another one will deal 600 damage to the other one. I also believe that that stuff ignores resistances and weaknesses, but I'm not entirely sure. And then also an enemy getting hit by a car is a fixed 100 damage, so there you go, that's a pretty solid fact. Another little thing I discovered thanks to having to constantly use Kunoichi's substitution jutsu skill was that if you keep on moving your party members as far as they can go and endlessly swapping characters, eventually when you get too far away, the game will sadly teleport you back, because I was really hoping you could just go forever and basically leave the fight. Then I also wanted to see how healing is calculated, considering they got rid of the healing stat from Yakuza Like a Dragon. My guess was just that it was based off your magic stat, so I got Sayako and Sonhee, who were both level 30 idols, and made it so that Sayako had no magic boosts, and Sonhee had a way higher magic stat. And after healing as both girls, you can see that Sayako healed way less than Sonhee. I also wanted to see if boosting magic with a buff could increase healing amount, but despite getting a level 3 buff, the healing stayed at the same level. I also didn't record it, but I boosted attack just to be absolutely sure they didn't screw up or anything. I did the same thing, but the results were the same. Then finally, I wanted to determine the actual formula the game uses to determine damage. I thought to put this at the end because it seems pretty concrete, but I could very much just be completely wrong. Now, I had a genius idea to determine it by getting a party member charmed and then having that party member attack another one, then pulling their stats and the damage dealt and going from there. Seemingly the only way to get one party member to attack another in this game is if one gets knocked down by an enemy, a charmed party member will then do a follow-up attack on that party member, which as I determined earlier is fine because it's basically the equivalent to a regular attack or a proximity attack anyway. Firstly, Adachi was in my party because he's weak to charm, and then Jungi Han and Sonhee are just there because they're there. And as you can see from this clip, I recorded Jungi Han displaying a complete lack of respect for his leader and punching her right in the stomach. But anyway, before I actually dive into results, I did this test a total of 7 times, although it was realistically 3 different tests. The first one was just with plain old regular gear, and from this first attack, Jungi Han dealt 247 damage. His attack in this test was 445, and Sonhee's defense was 393. I chucked in a random guess and did Jungi Han's attack minus half of Sonhee's defense, and so I got 248.5. So pretty quickly it seems like the formula is just whichever attack stat minus whichever defense stat divided by 2, and then times whatever modifier. But I thought to do more to be sure, bearing in mind the 5% damage range as per usual. Adachi with 336 attack attacked Kiryu with 416 defense, and it did 129 damage, which chucked into the formula was 128. Then Jungi Han landed a proximity attack on Kiryu, which gave me 297 damage, which when chucked into the formula and multiplied by the guesstimated 20% increase of a proximity attack, it gave me 284.4, which is a bit off, but it's likely I got quite a high damage roll in the recording. Then while testing for this video, I noticed the damage bottoms out at 1, so I made everyone's defense as high as I could get it whilst making everyone's attack as low as possible. Adachi with 184 attack hit Jungi Han with 428 defense, which should have given me negative 30, but instead it just gave me a big ol' 1. Then the third test was to make sure everyone's attack was as high as I could get it, and defense as low as I could get it. Sonhee with 408 attack hit Jungi Han with 211 defense, and I got 293 compared to the calculated 302.5, so pretty close. Then Adachi with 403 attack hit Sonhee with 196 defense and did 309 damage as opposed to the calculated 305 damage, so again pretty close. But then the final thing that proved a question I asked myself earlier in regards to resistances was that Sonhee again with 408 attack hit Adachi with 230 defense. Instead of dealing 293 as expected, did 144, which then meant it was roughly a 50% damage decrease because he was a samurai and so he resisted bladed attacks. So there you go, I think maybe job resistances are a 50% decrease, but I don't know about all the gear that reduces damage. I'm not going to be able to test all that accurately, unfortunately. But regardless, the formula does seem mostly correct, and after doing a few more attacks on random enemies with Jungi Han's stats from the first test, it does actually seem like the defense of enemies barely changes, but it makes sense because a difference of 10 defense in the formula would actually be 5 defense. But anyway, at the very least, defense is a combination of level and enemy type for enemies. And then finally, here's Namba doing whatever he's doing here. So all in all, the damage values for a lot of stuff in this game is way better thought out than in Yakuza Like a Dragon, but there are still a couple of things that are a bit silly. Even being able to see that Ichiban as a freelancer was dealing roughly the same amount of damage as Jungi Han, because they had very similar attack stats, is just shocking to me, because it shows that you're allowed to use whatever you want thanks to the extremely balanced balancing. The cost of this extremely balanced balancing though is that ironically it can make some skills obsolete or seemingly even even completely worthless. Considering how skill inheritance works, you can equip 3 skills that all deal light blunt damage with no additional properties, and you would probably only ever use whichever one costs the least amount of MP or something. However, what this does mean is that given how you're only allowed 5 skills plus 1 Kiwami skill in your inheritance slots, you can just slot in what you need based on whichever job you've made your character, so you have no need to have 3 skills that are all the same. This also means that if you never get the DLC jobs, or if in an entire playthrough of the game you have a job that was only ever level 1, you aren't going to be massively hindered like the last game, because there are a bunch of skills you could add to your loadout to compensate for areas you're lacking in, like adding a healing skill or a stat change or a grapple, so on and so forth. Anyway, this video was actually a shitload of fun to make, but it did take a stupid amount of time to record and wrap my head around things, especially stuff like trying to get hit by an enemy who just refuses to do what you want them to do because they're a little bastard. Although, what I'm not looking forward to is being told that my data is wrong in some way or I tested stuff incorrectly, and I'm not saying that in some sort of passive-aggressive way, but instead that I am a fucking idiot, and I really hope that I am somewhat right, because I hope this is useful information for people who think it's interesting, or like speedrunners and shit. Yeah, I do actually have an economics degree, which did involve a lot of maths, not as much as other degrees of course, but it's been like 2 years since I've done an Excel spreadsheet, and I did not at all remember like any of the shortcuts, so yeah. But anyway, if you like the video, what you should do is like the video 10 times and work out the average number of likes between all 10 attempts, then record each time you do it, and get 375 clips like I did. 375, man, far out.
What? Holy shit, is that Virgil?